to Otherland's Editing Podcast, where two speculative fiction writers and editors help you craft fantastical worlds by keeping an eye on exacting editing and foundational writing principles. Every 2 weeks, we bring you interviews with other writers, advice on editing and writers' craft pitfalls, and reviews of popular media to help you grow. So sit back, relax, and join Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss as we discuss all things writing and editing. Hi, this is Margaret Bates, and I want to welcome you to this week's edition of the Otherlands Editing Podcast. And I have Midnight Voss here with me again. And this week we are talking about adaptations and what goes wrong with them, what goes right, and how to look at adapting between different mediums or incorporating different aesthetics that you're inspired by into your writing. The first part is to say that we got inspired for this episode by looking at some of the buzz or anti-buzz, is there a word for that? Negative booze at The Electric State, which is Netflix's new somehow $320 million movie from the Russo brothers, who directed a lot of the Avengers films, and looking at how it started originally from a graphic novel that had been very well praised and had been really taken seriously as a piece of art, and instead got something that was neither of those things. Do you want to explain a little bit about, just in general, some brief plot points? It doesn't have much of a plot, so it's not a lot to worry about.
What?
Uh, it
Okay, so it's the 90s because aesthetics, and this girl's brother dies, but then doesn't die, and then he's in a robot. Also, there was a robot war at one point, and then she goes out to go find his body because he's not really dead, and then they fight a bunch of stuff, and then the brother actually dies. That's it. That's over.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. In a slightly less flippant way, it's basically like if E.T. met like Ready Player One or something. It's super derivative and it's super trying to go for this member berry, remember the 80s, remember the 90s aesthetic that's ripping off Spielberg stuff. It's supposed to make you care, but it doesn't. To be super general about it, Millie Bobby Brown from Stranger Things plays this girl out to find her actual brother because his consciousness is split into this robot. And she ends up bumping into Chris Pratt, as you do, who's like a smuggler and trades illicit goods from the 90s, like Billy the Big Mouth Bass and Twinkies or something. And they find the survivors of the robot war in this internment camp for robots, and they fight a big evil corporation because there's always a big evil corporation these days. And they win, but in order to win, she has to unplug her brother from powering the big evil corporation's drones. Again, it's based on a lot of vibes of we want to invoke nostalgia, which is often really odd because it's supposed to be set in like an alternate 1996 after there's been a big robot. Obviously, we don't remember robot war because that didn't happen 30 years ago. But a lot of the song cues and even the aesthetic of the feathered hair that especially both Millie Bobby Brown and that Chris that no one likes, Chris Pratt, that's it, feels kind of 80s. So I don't even think it knows what time era it's trying to mine for
It
nostalgia.
doesn't have a real strong identity, even in its aesthetic, as what it's doing. And I think that's like connected to some of the things that we've talked about is that there's no underlying substance to it. I assume that the graphic novel did actually have quite a lot of substance, but because they don't have a point of view, then it's just this frenetic reaching for things that might stoke nostalgia, and it
Yeah.
doesn't work that way.
Photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. You can't echo to something that echoes to something else when you don't have anything inside of your original package to begin with. It's thin. And I guess the one thing that I think they tried to adapt that people did give them compliments on is from the original aesthetic of the graphic novel. The graphic novel is there's a dystopia. I think in there was also a robot. And a lot of the countryside is overrun by weeds, and all the towns are in disrepair. And above them are floating futuristic looking billboards for Burger King. Basically, people are rotting away, or they've been killed, and the bodies are just left from the war, or they just plug into these things called the Neurocaster and just veg and VR and then rot away, literally, and kind of turn into skeletons and die. But the way that it's presented in the graphic novel is very bleak. It's not just dystopian, it's also nihilistic. And they really did not translate that nihilism or that in general capitalism, not just one guy, because in the movie they're very clear that all the problems are because one billionaire named Ethan Skate's a real bad dude, but once they get rid of him, everything's fine again. Because again, they're trying to tell a very simple story that doesn't upset anybody. So the original graphic novel from the pictures I've seen in reviews and things is really got this nihilistic tone that the Electric State Netflix film was like, no, we don't need that. That would not sell tickets or that would not get people to watch us. Comes off, I think, feeling like a movie that A is about nothing, or at least nothing in depth that you haven't seen a billion times before in a blockbuster. And I think also the thing I kept going through as I was watching it was who is this actually for? What is the intended audience for this film?
You can tell that they want to get the young kids watching this. They had a little bit of sequel bait there at the end of they wanted the robots to be like something that they might want to collect, but they're so ugly. Of like a, but at the same time, to connect to what you were saying is that it can't really be for the kids because they didn't live that. And there are certain things that you can affect a historical nostalgia for, which would be nostalgia for something that you never had as a kid. They do in certain things, like Stranger Things, like they do that, and people, oh, back in the day, or like I was born in the wrong era. I love the Beatles, but it doesn't really work in this because of the way that they're using it, and because kids wouldn't have any reference to a lot of these things. Again, the Billy Bass of who's thinking about that as
Like I lived in the
teenage.
90s. I've never thought about Billy Bass since it was a thing on like infomercials. No one's
The
like
only thing
into it.
I remember about that is you would have a couple of jokes about how annoying it was. It'd be like if you made Clippy a main character, that the only reason to do that would be to kill him brutally. And so
Yeah.
like it's not something that really had that much cultural significance. It's just the idea of what happened in the 90s. Let's come up with a couple of touch points. Um,
L- Like a Zagnut bar is all Chris Pratt wants to eat, or he's trading them. He's dealing with them so he can't eat them when he gets hungry. And I'm like, and I eat a lot of candy. I'm not gonna lie, but I had to really Google what the heck a Zagnut bar was. I think one thing is, from what I could tell from the clips of the book that I'd seen in other reviews and it got into it, is that some of the aesthetics for the robots are more like what if sort of advertisement bots or things that have this 50s, 60s Mickey Mouse, literally Bob's Big Boy aesthetic were robotic and used as servants so then they revolt, but they also at the same time when they're rebelling are literally like a Bob's Big Boy advertisement bot. So it has that interesting aesthetic of the 50s, 60s thing and a lot of the robot characters who are our heroes. There's this male woman bot, and she doesn't have exactly like a Betty Boop face, but she has this 40s, 50s aesthetic to her face. So I get that they were trying to bring that aesthetic divorced the nihilism from the original graphic novel to make what you said like merchandisable robot friends. But it all falls apart because eventually the concept of why do we have these robots at all in this alternate 1996 is that in like the 60s when they opened Disney World, there were automaton robots at Disney World. So they have the Mickey White gloves and all of that. And so they're kind of like 50s bots and we have to defeat them with it just none of it really adheres together.
There are just so many of them, and none of them really connect. I think that if there had been a point of connection, again, like you mentioned that early on, that it's kind of like ET, but the problem is that she can't talk to her brother. He just talks in catchphrases. And because I'm not connected to any of the characters, I can't really immerse in this world. I'm too busy saying, why is it like this? And if they had not spent so much money on it and just animated it, I probably wouldn't be questioning it as much because I don't know, there's a level divorced from reality when it's an animation. So
Yeah, like it could have been like a weird sort of hear me out, cousin of something like the Wild Robot or Iron Giant, but also sort of Brave Little Toaster vibes because the
Oh
robots are
yeah.
semi-inanimate. I mean, they are supposed to be alive, but you can get that kind of vibe of these inanimate beings that have set out on a quest. But you're right, you get so many robots that you don't really get any time with any one of them, even her brother, except he talks in these stock phrases like Bumblebee in the stupid Transformers movies. I guess they wanted to copy that.
But I
But none of
also
the
would
robots
say
are
that
distinct enough, really.
even Chris Pratt's character, even Millie Bobby Brown's character, like they're not really characters. They don't have anything going on. Neither of them has an arc of they just kind of
No.
show up and do things because her brother is brilliant, but his brilliance has nothing to do with the plot. He just had a neat brain that they wanted to run Skylink on. So
Yeah,
Skylink, Skynet, whatever.
he's basically like if they had the batteries from the Matrix. It's the same thing. Like even though it's established in the very first scene that he's some genius who can outcode and do math problems that Einstein couldn't do in 3 days in like 30 minutes. It's a plot point for half a second. They're like, no, we just took him up because his brain's so special. It runs our whole who gives a crap? Neuralink. It's not Neuralink, it's neuro something, but it's the same idea. Like all our brains are online in VR.
Squinky, squinky.
Yeah, but it
Yeah,
has
like
nothing to do with him being smart. It's just he's got a special magic brain.
which means that we also got that scene at the beginning and it had no purpose. There was no reason to even watch that scene. It made me so angry. So we have the scene where it's like, "Oh, brother, you're so special. I have no goals of my own." And then we go into a 10-minute news clip about the war.
It's
And
at
then
least 6 or 7, and it gives serious Forrest Gump vibes because they even, and this is true, like CGI a version of like 90s Bill Clinton signing a peace accords with the head of the evil robots and the billionaire guy who's supposed to be helping humanity with his drones or whatever. But the head of the robots who gets into the internment camp is, I kid you not, Mr. Peanut from Planters Peanuts. So yeah, you get like the first scene with my brother's smart and I have no goals, and then like a 6 minute video reel of this is what happened in the war. The next scene is you're back with Millie Bobby Brown, but her hair has changed color. So now you know she's having a sad thinking about sad things while trying to get her ankle monitored off. Now she's clearly in foster care, and you're like, what happened to her family? From like literally 5 minutes ago. It has three starts in a row.
yeah, they really could have just started with Millie Bobby Brown as where she is, start where the story is, and then given us some backstory with a clip of the news. I didn't need the whole news program.
They were
Thanks.
super proud about that Bill Clinton CGI for the 90s aesthetic thing, and they were going to use it, darn it. Which oddly, it
Mm.
looks worse than a lot of the Forrest Gump CGI 30 years ago. So that's a lot. That's a sign that I find with a lot of bad movies that I think also translates sometimes to books that I'm not going to say are bad, but definitely need subsequent drafts to really smooth out and figure out where your starting point actually is. We were joking as we were watching The Electric State that the three or four beginnings that couldn't decide where to start reminded us of Morbius, which is never good to be compared to Morbius. So in that one, you start in the cave and you're exploring some bats. And no, it's a flashback to Greece and like I assume the 1990s because Morbius isn't that old, but it looks like 1968. So I don't know if that's just Greece being old. And then he did not go into the Nobel Peace Awards as an adult. And like you're like, wait, stop. It's been 10 minutes. Where am I going? Electric State very much has that same problem of wait, I've had like two flashbacks and a start, and where am I supposed to be focusing? I'm not even getting enough scene time. Assuming Millie Bobby Brown's character had a character, her name is technically Michelle, but it doesn't matter. It's Millie Bobby Brown. Even if she had a character, I'm jumping around from scene to scene so much that I can't get some kind of sympathy or connection to her in the first 10 to 15 minutes because I'm so discombobulated. So I think that's one thing is as you're writing a book, as you're writing even a novella, saying, where am I actually starting my story? And I think you're right, Midnight, that you could have started it with her at her desk in her bedroom trying to get the ankle monitor off and her awful foster dad yelling at her. And that could have been a start because they don't trust the audience to understand and intuit as you go through the honestly minimal world building. There's been a robot war. We're in an alternative timeline, and this is picking up the pieces after something like that's happened. And I guess maybe the Russo brothers were justifying it to themselves with if we have the first scene with her and her brother hanging out at the school where he's testing for his big day to get skipped grades to college, we'll see they have an affinity for each other, but it's so generic. It doesn't feel like anything because they
It's
don't
so
feel like
weird.
unique siblings. Yeah.
They don't seem like people. The swelling of the music is this is like third act music swell kind of stuff. It's so bizarre. I know I'm not the only person who thought that because we were watching some YouTube videos and they were like reacting, what was this scene? It's so strange. Um
I should
and
also note that on the nostalgia bomb aspect of this movie, they also hired Alan Silvestri, who scored Back to the Future and Forrest Gump. And so he's very famous for these emotional swells, but in movies like Forrest Gump or Back to the Future, they're earned. So doing it 1 minute into people we don't know is
I know
super random.
don't go here.
Yeah, no, pretty much. It felt like any two people being like, I miss you, sister. I'll miss you, brother. And you're like, I don't know who you are.
Struggles.
Yeah. And then I think another thing we talked about, and I hit on a little bit, is just this aesthetic without the substance, where it's like clearly they thought the art of the graphic novel it's based on was lovely or haunting, but then they divorced it from anything that was actually haunting about it because it's not, even the pictures I've seen in reviews, it's not something that bangs you over the head with this is my point. I mean, it sets you up, it has an interwoven component between the story and the text and the pictures, etc. But it's this really haunting, nihilistic, everything's broken landscape. And somehow, I guess because money, they changed that to an aesthetic to be how could we literally be a 90-minute Planters Peanut commercial? And that's really not getting it when obviously a big part of the original graphic novel is nihilism because of overconsumption and capitalism. And they're like, no, just this one billionaire is bad, but have Planters Peanuts. In fact, it's even more distracting because when you watch it on Netflix, it automatically starts with a 90-second ad that is directly from Planters Peanuts. It's just super weird. They didn't
Yeah.
get it.
They didn't get it or they don't care to get it. So I think that means we need to segue into one of our main topics here is like there are things that you can do in certain media that will enhance your message or create different buy-in from the reader or creator or player. And that is just different. And there is a way to create something that looks very artistic and desolate in a graphic novel that you're not necessarily going to be able to translate to live action. It's very hard actually to translate comics, and it doesn't surprise me that the creators of this were behind some of the Avengers movies, because I think that even if some of these superhero movies are great, I love comics, and it's very easy for the needs of mass marketing to iron out all the differences in charm and treat everything like a gimmick. That's what it feels like with Electric State, is that they've gotten this aesthetic, but it's also the gimmick of look at these weird looking robots. That's it, because they can't handle more complexity than that, but you can handle a lot more on the page because people are reading it very quickly. So
Yeah.
like they're taking it in and processing it in a different way. There's differences in the way that you can do pacing in comics. This is something that we've seen over and over again when they try to do these live action versions of anime
Manga,
and
especially.
manga. And they're like, that 5 episodes will cut it for an anime that was 100 episodes, Yu Yu Hakusho. We recently watched Uzumaki, which they gave them 4 episodes. My God. The problem with this is that a lot of these, by nature, this graphic novel may be serial, is you may have one that goes from point A to point B in a regular plot structure, but you also may have them jumping around or doing things with time because they can. And so
Yeah.
when you take that and you push it into a different medium and don't consider the limitations of that, then you're going to get a mess.
We
But
actually watched two versions of Uzumaki. We watched the version that's the HBO animated anime, which is still too short because it's got apparently the entirety of that manga's run, but it's I think each of the episodes like 25 or 30 minutes, and there's only four. So you're right. There's some episodes that feel like the lead character, the heroine, is Kyrie. And it feels like, gosh, this girl can't catch a break. I come back from we don't pay for the non-ad version of HBO. So you come back from your little 2 minute break about a snack or a deodorant, and all of a sudden Kyrie's got another hospital problem she's in for. And you're like, this just happened to
yeah,
her 10 minutes ago. And it's just disorienting.
yeah.
You know, I think thinking about what the limitations of the medium you're working with is really important. As disjointed or rushed, I think is really more the word, as the anime could feel. The theatrical film, which is live action from 20 years ago, felt both very slow in its pacing and like it didn't decide what it wanted to do, which is not 100% its fault. The manga wasn't completed by then, so they didn't know the ending. But what I will say is they, bless their hearts, probably had like MS Paint and a bag of Fritos and some Coca-Cola or whatever as their budget and like some duct tape. So they obviously didn't have a lot of money, but then they did make the active decision to make a live action version of a manga that even by that time that many installments was out was very heavily body horror based, and that's a kind of expensive set of special effects. So one of the reasons I feel like they had to do slow pacing and focus for a really, really long time on just Kyrie even noticing things were happening in a spiral really starting to heat up about 45 minutes into the 90-minute movie is they didn't have but so many special effects they could do, which
I don't
obviously
think
you
we
don't have to
ever
worry about.
fully got the Sneeple. I'm very disappointed without having snail people around. It's just so
No, the snail
sad.
people are great and they are really fun in the animated anime version because there's a lot of snail people in that first and second episode. So if you like snail people who make eggs, then this is the show for you. But again, it's like their constraints. Obviously, it felt rushed in the anime because you're taking all the manga into less than 2 hours. It felt like nothing was happening, bless its heart, in the live action movie because they didn't have the budget to mimic what was the real terrifying body horror and some eldritch horror, cosmic level horror of
Yeah, there was no way
manga
they were going to be able to
either.
do that.
They couldn't afford it. So it's kind of just like drawing time. I don't know what they thought. They wanted to real badly.
This is neither here nor there, but I feel like people have lost their ability to work with no budget because there were absolutely moments from 80s movies where something looked absolutely beautiful and they really literally just painted that on something and used camera tricks to make it look like it was real.
Yeah, there's
So,
something to really be said for matte painting, which is a skill that I think people have lost. But if you look at something early 90s is actually Newsies because the sets are obviously indoors or whatever, but they do these beautiful matte paintings at scale. They do the sort of film trickery to give you these visions of 1900s, turn of the century New York, sunrise and sunset, and it's gorgeous. But you see that kind of matte painting examples and things, also like certain broader scenes of the city in Ghostbusters or vistas in The Princess Bride. I think you're right. I don't think they have that skill to do that anymore.
yeah. Well, we got Mr. Peanut. So, let's move this along and talk about video games because this is another arena where people want to make movies out of it or they want to take it to another venue. And it's extremely challenging to do that. I think everyone knows this if they're like, oh, let's make this series into a video game, and everyone's anxious.
Well, yeah, I think we can name on one hand the number of good adaptations people like of video games. And even starting in the mid 90s, there's just a graveyard of, oh, geez, this was terrible. I'm gonna throw my hat in the ring and say that I think the worst video game adaptation is probably House of the Dead, but Uwe Boll's a special version of hell will never bring you to, dear listeners. But we all know the 90s Doom or the Mortal Kombat. Like there've been some really bad movies. And I think one that comes to mind that's been hard to adapt, even though it's so quintessential, is Super Mario Brothers. So
Which its original adaptation was iconic in its own way, especially in that way where they did not try to make it look like the original game at all.
if you don't know, because it isn't on streaming, we looked. I think you can buy the DVD, but I'm not even sure it's on that. But the original 93 Super Mario Brothers, starring John Leguizamo and Bob Hoskins, who was British, by the way, he was, as Mario. You know, right there, things are a little weird. But it's basically where Mario and Luigi get sucked into an alternate dimension, which, okay, follows the games. But in this case, it's like almost the neo gritty underbelly of a cyberpunk dystopia. It looks more like we're trying to be Blade Runner on a tiny budget than it does Super Mario. It's very odd. And everybody there is descended from dinosaurs, and King Koopa is played by lovely scenery chewing Dennis Hopper. But he is much more, and this is not a hidden secret, more like a kind of a send up of Donald Trump or an 80s building tycoon or like a corrupt politician, all those kind of mixed together. And there's fungus and de-evolution guns and special boots that
Big
make you
Bertha
jump really high.
with her
Yeah.
spiky dress. Shout out
And
Big Bertha, you killed it.
the like mushroom people aren't Goombas, they're like people who get de-evolved, so they're like 7 feet tall with tiny little like lizard heads. I don't know. It's a mess. It's a mess, but it's a mess that's kind of delightful in a way because it's like source material. What source material? We just really want to tell this post-apocalyptic story that's kind of a rip off on If You Squint a Blade Runner. So this is what you get. And you're like, well, this is a thing that happened. So I guess it's bad. No one liked it. No one said it was good. Everyone was very confused when it came out, but I think it has in the
I
internet
liked it.
in intervening 30 years, it has had a lot of love to it as a B movie that's so bad it's good because it swung for the fences the complete opposite direction and it
Right. I'll
created
tell you
something
why it works though.
special. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the reason it works is that Luigi has a character arc. Like he has stuff that he's trying to go through. Daisy has things she's trying to accomplish. Mario, God bless him, doesn't want to be here, but he gets on board with it. So
He's
you
the
it's
ultimate
all in
skeptic.
character. Because they ground those characters, we don't care if King Koopa is basically Donald Trump, but you know, back then it was funny. So they've got this like stupid guy de-evolving people, trying to take over the underground, and it doesn't matter because you're following characters doing things. So no one thought it was a good movie for the Mario Brothers, but it's entertaining as what it is.
Yeah,
And they
it's
don't
got
have to
some
have
moments you
millions of
remember.
dollars to do it.
No, I will say, I'm sure it did cost some chunk for that day and age, adjusting for inflation, but also there are definitely ways they saved budget and had like maybe one through street and like five cars that went on like a conveyor belt or whatever. I think the grounding is that Luigi is actually your focal character, and he's the one you follow on the journey because he's in there and he wants to help save the Princess Daisy. He's the one who's the wide-eyed dreamer between the two of them because Mario is actually, if you know anything about Bob Hoskins, he was also in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He's significantly older at the time than John Leguizamo, and he's obviously passed on since then. So there's this line that like, yeah, Mario, he's like my brother, but he's also like my mom and my dad because he raised me. So he's a significantly older brother in this story. So Luigi is this very much wide-eyed dreamer going on his first heroing arc, and it's engaging. And to be fair, in the hands of lesser actors, it would probably fall apart. But John Leguizamo and Bob Hoskins are both so engaging, even in really odd films, that they're very fun to watch. And you're right, there are characters there to root for that ground us.
And if you take that back to the newer one, so while we're ragging on Chris Pratt, you have done my people wrong. But he wasn't that bad in Super Mario Brothers. He just kind of wasn't there. So as far as voice acting was, it could have been anyone. But I think when we were watching this new Super Mario Brothers, it was pretty.
It's
At least
very
they didn't
pretty.
at least they didn't spend the money poorly.
No,
Um,
I did say to you at least once, I was like, oh, if I had seen this in the theater, I'd really enjoy it because the animation is gorgeous and the looks of some of the worlds they immerse you in is really gorgeous. And they work, especially at playing with three-dimensional space because they can because they're animated and like having jumps and up and going through the levels and all the kind of things you would do in the video games. Their visual sense is good.
yeah, but I would on top of that say that Luigi basically is not there for most of the movie.
Poor
He is
Luigi.
he has more of an arc than Mario does.
Yeah,
His
it's true.
arc is I don't like mushrooms, and in the end I still don't like mushrooms.
Yeah, it's Mario's whole arc. Luigi's arc is Dutzel. Basically, he gets captured by Bowser, and he's for about half the movie disappears in the middle part because Mario's off questing to save him. They don't have a lot of scenes with Luigi in captivity, really. So you kind of end up with that same problem we had back when we talked about the second Doctor Strange movie, the
Yeah,
multiversal
Multiverse of
madness,
Madness. Hmm.
where America Chavez could have been played by Bean or Chihuahua or like a lamp. In this case, Luigi, until about the third act, towards the very end where he has a part to play, could have been a lamp that Mario just wanted to get back and save, and it would have had as much like import on the plot, to be super honest with you.
But if you look at him in the beginning and the end, he starts off being someone who's got a lot of fears, and at the end, he's like, okay, let's go. So I don't know that he
Yes.
overcame his fears because there's a good chance he's going to be in a haunted mansion at some point. But there's something that happened to him. With Mario, it's just like, I feel bad about myself because I'm short and I don't know when to quit. And at the end, I don't know when to quit. But also, my dad's proud of me. So I guess there's that of
Yeah,
like,
some of
he
his
doesn't have
arcs seem to change. Like I thought more of his arc was going to be like Spike, the local neighborhood plumber who I quit working for, who's kind of a bully, doesn't respect me because I'm small. I thought that would come back more. I thought it was more like I feel not powerful enough issues, but then it somewhere became my dad issues. But those, it felt like they came on mid movie. It was weird.
That's because Donkey Kong has daddy issues and they bonded over his daddy issues, so Mario had to also have daddy issues.
Yeah, but it felt like they tacked those on literally mid-story and we're like, oh, you should
Yeah.
go back and no, let's not go back and add
He
any
does
more
have that
context.
thing at the beginning with his family being jerks of they're like,
Yeah,
you big dreamer wanting to be a plumber. Um, which
make good money.
I mean, that's kind of the opposite of like you're going into a business that everyone will always need.
Yeah,
So that's wild of
there are
saying
three
that,
things you need: your mechanic, your plumber, and your computer repair guy slash internet repair guy. If anything happens to
yeah,
those three things, your life is done until you can fix them.
yeah, I don't know. But so it wasn't bad. But again, it had some pacing problems, and that's because they tried to shove five different games into it. Um,
Yeah, I feel like it's a reaction to the opposite of this Mario Brothers movie from 1993 has literally nothing about Super Mario in it. Let's put all the games in this one movie. So it's like the manga squeezing all the volumes into the movie. It's all the video game versions into the movie. They went all the way to Donkey Kong and Mario Kart.
they just wanted to put everything in it. And I will give it to them that some of the world building is entertaining to watch. Like what if it is just kind of how they get around all these things that move all the time?
Yeah, no, I mean it's
Disorienting.
not. I thought it would be bad because I'm gonna be honest, I'm predisposed to not like Chris Pratt, so I'll hop to it. But it wasn't terrible. It just didn't have any characterization. So it was a beautiful world, but a lot was going on, and we had so many things crammed in, we couldn't really grab onto the characters, but there wasn't really a lot about Peach or Mario or Luigi, the princess in this case is Peach, that made them interesting or even made their motives make a lot of sense. I don't think Peach's motives made a super ton of sense early on.
She's just around. She's just doing her thing.
Well, she's I go on this quest to talk to Donkey Kong to get his army, his dad's army to fight King Bowser. And she spends a day though making sure the human Mario gets a montage. And I think it's because if he uses a mushroom to get tall, then he can be really formidable. So I guess she thought that would help because all the toads are tiny. But it's not really made explicit. And it's like, well, you seem to be really under the gun to get to Donkey Kong's army, but then you took a day or two to indulge Mario and train him, even though he's not good at what he's doing. It's just a
There's
little
also no
muddled.
real reason for her not to just get the mushroom herself and fight Donkey Kong. She seems capable enough.
I think because woman,
Yes.
yeah.
Hmm.
So I mean, both versions are obviously flawed adaptations of the video game. It's just that one, I think, tries to do too much at once, so you don't get enough characterization to make it go through. And the other one just went and did its own thing, possibly while on peyote.
It's really hard to do both. It's hard to do like the feeling of the video game as well as the characterization at the same time. So I'm going to shift us away. We did have an example from The Last of Us that was good, but it was good, so I'm not going to say anything about it. With Five Nights at Freddy, it's really actually hard to get the feeling of playing that game into a movie format because the first couple of games are just you trying to check a bunch of screens so these evil animatronics don't kill you. And that's like the first, second, and a couple of the other games. There's one sister location where you get to move around a little bit more. Then they have this whole expansive lore background to it of what really happened. So, inconsistent lore, the feeling of the video game where you're actively making the choices, like you're in the driver's seat, not something you can do with the movie. You have to have a character to follow. Then you have on the opposite ends of the spectrum. I know Willy's Wonderland isn't actually the movie, but Willy's Wonderland gives you the feeling of being in that movie because he goes around, he fights some animatronics, and then he, I don't know, did a little
Leaves.
mini side game, like a what are they?
Side quest?
There's a specific thing of like when you have a little mini game. I think it's just called a mini game. I'm so tired. You have like a little mini game in between the you go off and you try to hit this ping pong bong or something, and it's nothing else. Like he doesn't have a character. He talks like you said, like maybe once, and but
I
you
don't
have
know
the
if Nick
feeling of
Cage is
being in a
like,
video
I'll
game.
charge you more if I have to learn more dialogue, but it feels like he did because I think he says one or two lines at the very end of the movie, but you go through 85 minutes and it's basically silent because he just reacts to whatever the animatronics might say, but he doesn't say anything. So it
So
is
he
very gaming
fights,
because there's no dialogue.
he beats the level, he does his mini game, he goes on, and he doesn't talk. So he is that silent protagonist that you get in so many video games. You're like, why doesn't this person talk? They just don't. Um,
Yeah, no, they just
because
don't.
they're supposed to be you. And on the other end of that, they have the actual Five Nights at Freddy movie, which was contentious among people who played the game because there's so much lore that you can't, you got to pick something. And you had to make Mike a real character instead of just some guy who flips screens on and off. So it's a challenge. But I think they did okay with it. They did a couple of shoehorny phrases in there that I don't think was advisable, but they got a good cast. They tried to put some characterization and motivation behind it, and it didn't look terrible. What else am I asking for?
I think the other thing is when you talk about adaptations or you're talking about going from one medium to another, I know this sounds real basic, but they are different mediums. They have different purposes, they have different structures and conventions. And when you change from one medium to the other, there are things that you can do in a book to a movie, which obviously, unless you have some magical budget or know someone in Hollywood, is probably not going to happen for you, but props if it does. But it goes the same way. I think that's why we're talking about the aesthetics that they wanted to translate from the graphic novel of Electric State to the, we'll call it a movie because it technically does have a beginning, middle, and an end, and it does move. But when you take something that might be an aesthetic or an idea or something you saw or want to emulate from a video game, from a movie, from a manga, that they exist in a different way, in a different set of conventions than what you might do when you're laying out a novel.
Yeah. As there's different expectations, there's different things you can do. This goes all the way back to Scott McCloud's Understanding Comets, where you're thinking about putting things in different ways on the page in a visual medium bridges things for the audience in a different way because you know that in your novel people are going to be engaging on the written word. You have to evoke that through words. You don't have anything else.
I mean, there's certain things about movies that, for good or ill, that old saw about a picture's worth a thousand words does apply. So there are things where you can set the mood or the tone or understand who a character is with a lot of shorthand of like a visual, like right away. I guess memorable character entrances or something. You get who they are based on just I see what they look like, what they're dressed like, how people react to them when they come on the scene. I think a really good example of that is even if he's been around in the Has-Been Hotel previously, you really get a feeling for Alistair as a demon and how powerful and badass he is when he's going into the city and people just see him on the street. And these other demons, by the way, they're just lesser demons. They just run the hell away. They don't even stop. They just go no. And
Somebody sets himself on fire.
yeah, like this is he's a guy who is dark and makes jokes around the hotel, and we know he's a pretty higher ranking guy, even though he's come into a bad way. But when you see people literally set themselves on fire to avoid him, you go, oh, and it's like a one image where you're like, oh, he's that dangerous if you make him mad. And you can do that in a movie, but in a book, you have to lay out the whole scene and describe it and decide how you'll show that reaction. Again, we've talked earlier about in other episodes about if you've pigeonholed yourself into a point of view and now it's all from Alistair's perspective and you're not giving yourself anything but first person Alistair perspective in a book, you can't do that. This allows you to have that one shot, scene, character beat of I'm going to set myself on fire rather than be near this dude. So again, there are certain things movies or TV can do because they're so heavily visual or should be that books can't. But there's things that books can do that movies can't or shouldn't. I don't mind a narration in a film if it's done well. And there's some narrations in film that can be very fun. I think we talked previously about Harley Quinn because she's an unreliable narrator in Birds of Prey. So a lot of what she says is almost like gets at her character and makes you kind of question the timeline of the film and the heist and all of this and how it's been set up with the diamond. Conversely, you can have narration that is just there because it was in the book and all it does is slow pacing and be a crutch because you don't set up characters on your own in a film way. And a good example of this is Twilight, which actually reduces a lot of Bella's narration from the book because it's told from her perspective. And it's actually beneficial to Twilight because as annoying as Bella is as a narrator in the film, she's 100 times more annoying and self-involved in the book. So you actually get the better version. I know that sounds impossible in Twilight. And in the Fifty Shades of Grey, which is basically the same book, let's be honest, and the same movie idea, except with BDSM instead of vampires. There is no Anastasia Steele inner monologue or narration at all, which is very good because in the book, it makes her sound like she's a child. I mean, yeah, she's like 19 or 20 and about to graduate college or something, but her weird refusal to use adult words, and she sounds like she must have been some sort of homeschooled church kid. She's not, but it reads like she is. And just how immature she is really off-putting and infantilizes her. So there's times when you have to do a heavy lifting with writing your character and writing their narration and then balancing out, am I overdoing it or am I writing the narration of someone who's actually not really likable and I'm not aware of it?
I think the interesting thing about having just the words at your disposal, if we're talking about you going from your inspiration from a movie or a game or your favorite CW show, then you have ways to affect voice on the page. And it's worth practicing that because there's so many things you can do that will almost make the reader hear the voice. And that brings so much more to your characterization that they're just not going to get because narration in video in like movies is not as interesting.
It
Um,
isn't. And I think it can be a crutch unless you have it there for a sardonic or undercutting purpose for some reason.
yeah, there are uses for it, but I mean, there are limitations when you use it in a movie or a show. Of obviously, if you're doing something like what Veronica Mars, then you can have your narration or whatever. But
Which is fair because it's taking its original roots, obviously, because she's a detective, PI even in high school, coming from the original roots of the pulp fiction and the actual novels and Raymond Chandler stuff of the 1940s. And that's the convention that detectives narrate their stuff. It's kind of the
or we
same DNA,
just
which is, yeah.
we just watched Companion, and I didn't mind the slight narration in there because I like to be reassured that the person that I hate is going to die. So that it was a slight hindrance for me in Heretic, not knowing for sure that something bad was going to happen to him because I see so many movies where they just torture women and that's it. So I guess spoilers for Heretic,
Well,
something bad
kind of, but it's
happens.
literally the
You
first
could have
line
guessed
of the
something bad was
film.
going to happen.
Yeah,
What?
well, her first line of narration is literally, I'm going to kill X. And you're like, well, I'm here for the ride. It's about
Yeah,
the,
good
the
for her. I
journey,
don't know
not
what's
the
happening. Let's
destination.
go.
Yeah, pretty much.
Helps set the
Um,
tone, but she's not doing it throughout the whole thing. It's like they
this
just
this is a
said it.
huge spoiler for a different movie from, let's say it's 97, 98, called Fallen. So again, if you haven't seen the Denzel Washington movie Fallen, pause, whatever. Okay, you're back. This movie does a very similar thing that plays it in a coy way compared to the narration in Companion, where he also starts out and he says, Denzel Washington is the narrator's voice says, let me tell you about the time I almost died. And you're like, okay. And essentially, the story is about a demon that body hops. And the last act is Denzel Washington's gone out to a cabin in the woods, remote from anybody. He figures if he kills himself with the demon inside of him, the demon can't escape because there's no other humans around. And you're like, great, it's sad, he's killed himself, but now the demon will never hurt anybody else's life. There's a freaking cat. And apparently the demon just needs a warm body. If it's a cat, it's fine. So then you hear the narration again, and the demon's like, well, let me tell you, I told you this was the time I almost died. So they take what companion plays straight, they take it as a way to twist your assumptions and then twist the knife at the end when you realize, oh, our hero did not succeed at all and he's dead for no reason. But yeah, I mean, there's things you can do with narration, but if you just do it because you're too lazy in a film to do your own like visuals and world building and character development, that usually doesn't work and slows your pacing down.
Yeah, pacing is hard. I mean, it
It's
doesn't have to
really
be
hard.
perfect, but it's something that you really want to attend to. It throws everything off if it's really too bad.
That's one other thing also, because you mentioned it when you talked about, oh, you like a CW show or a TV show and you want to adapt the aesthetic, or even if you're intermediate step of an adaptation, is fanfic, you get into their heads more and you get to get into their perspective more. And you said the interstitials, but it also is, you have more time in a novel to take a beat literally and do what we call scene and sequel, the scene where there's an action or an event happens, but the sequel where the character has a moment to reflect and show how that's emotionally impacting them. In a 40-minute television show, they don't always have the time to do the reflection of the character, but you have that, and that's part of building out your character to flesh them out, to make them be compelling, to make the narrative be compelling, to have them have reactions to things. And I know that sounds basic, but sometimes that gets left out. It can get elided often in TV or movies because they only have so much time to show it and so much budget. But in a book, you have to make sure that just because things happen to your character, they don't walk through it like the Terminator. They have to react to things and actually have emotions and thoughts about them.
Anybody who's trying to do like the lit RPG stuff, you have to be watchful of the repetition. In a game, you're doing something. This is also with television. So, two examples, I'll give you them. So, of the first part, in video games, you can actually flip someone's shit if you're if you manage to have them go through a door and have everything upside down all of a sudden because you go through so many doors, you do so many things over and over again that if you disrupt that, then you can have a huge effect. But the point is that in video games, you end up doing things over and over and over and over and over again. So you don't really notice. But if you're trying to narrativize that, then you want to be careful about the ways that you're repeating things. And likewise, in dialogue, because people are stupid and forget the characters' names all the time, in television, people say each other's names every other line. It is obnoxious. If you write it out, it's obnoxious. So, like, that's something that you want to be aware of their how do you affect this character's voice without him saying the person's name every line?
That's really hard. That's a whole other like kettle of fish too when you get to people who don't understand how dialogue works, so characters call each other by their names all the time. I mean, there is this repetition of games, and I don't play games. I honestly tapped out at like Donkey Kong Country because I'm not good at first person shooters, and after an N64 I lost it. I just couldn't do the perspective. But I do watch a lot of TV, and they are also very serialized by their nature, their series. So you also get some of the repetition of certain things that you can't necessarily do in a book, or people get the feeling of, we just did this.
There's also the thing in television where you have their repeated behaviors as they end up. This is something that you've mentioned before as like the pancakes are not plot, of like they move the characters around to certain settings because that's where they have their sets. Okay, we're at the coffee shop, we're at the dinner table, we're at the coffee shop, we're at the club, we're at work, we're at the coffee shop. If you're thinking of what feels natural in the television show doesn't feel quite as natural in like, why are we back here? Why is this scene here again?
When I also talk about pancakes are not plot, I feel like that's why a lot of books creep in scenes where they're having breakfast or a meal, but it doesn't actually forward plot. Because again, a lot of TV characters, especially sitcom characters, will have scenes where they're sitting in a living room or a family room or a bedroom. But in a lot of sitcoms, if they're going to have a scene, they're often going to put it in a kitchen or like a coffee shop because it gives literally the stage directions, the actors things to do and move around and hold and handle. Whereas sitting on a sofa between two people isn't very engaging. Having them make juice or make scotch or whatever is engaging, or at least it gives them the illusion of movement and illusion of an interior life. So I think that accidentally bleeds into a lot of people's books where they're like, well, my TV show does this, or I'm used to seeing this in movies, so I'll just put in this because they're talking. So they're technically talking and they're technically eating. So that's plot, but it's not actually, it's really just interstitial filler.
Yeah.
And so
As
that
long
does
as you
blur.
as long as you find a way to move that scene along, you can have that because it
Oh
is a
yeah.
good way to have the characters being doing stuff while they're talking about something if you need them to talk, right? Instead of just standing there and staring at each other.
But it needs to
Which is
forward the
sometimes the first draft of the scene. They're standing there staring at each other. Okay, now what are they
yeah, but it's like driving eventually either the goal of that particular chapter and moving the character to solving his conflict in his GMC or her GMC eventually. If you're just having some cool banter, and I love banter, but if you're just having some cool banter over the kitchen, then sometimes you can lose it. Like sometimes it becomes a scene that you're right, in your first draft sounds good, but if you can't find a way to make it do multiple types of lifting, it may get excised by the final draft.
Yeah.
I think the serial nature happens again. Sorry, it's so ubiquitous, and even if it's been 13 years, it is really famous. So it does remind me of 50 Shades of Grey because it has a lot of what I call plot cul-de-sacs. What a lot of people will be like, well, that happened, and then just keep moving on moments because it was originally written as a never-ending fanfic on originally fanfic.net. So a lot of times you'll have, especially towards the middle movie, which is the middle of the story in the fanfic, is a lot of these things that don't go anywhere but seem big at the time, and then like the next chapter they're not ever heard of again, which is this mix of being episodic and stuff and kind of like a soap opera but written in fanfic form. Some big things happen, like Christian's ex sub comes back and she's not well, so she tries to shoot Anna, and that's kind of dealt with at the end of the book, and she doesn't come back in book 3 at all. Or Christian is in a whole helicopter crash, a whole big crash. He's lost, people are worried, his family's crying over the TV. 2 chapters later, he shows up and it's not a big deal, barely an inconvenience. And that really is grating in book form. But I suppose if you're reading it week to week as a fanfic, like little episodes until she got enough comments to post the next chapter, that week or two of delay till the like, oh, it's fine chapter was more gratifying. So you just have to be aware of that kind of thing of, are you making something a bit too episodic, which doesn't really fit a novel? Also, I think that fits the umbrella of if characters keep reminding you of things that have literally just happened a couple of chapters back, as if you have amnesia, that can also be an artifact of episodic adaptation from if you had a serial novella on something like Radish before you made it just a novel or a fanfic that you file the serial numbers off of. There's definitely that feeling of if it hasn't been filed enough or readjusted to the format of a novel of, oh, I get it. This is for someone who has like dementia because you keep saying the same thing every other chapter, but I have memory. So I guess my question is, do you have other thoughts on adaptation or other things about keeping aware of what your medium you're choosing to write in or work with and like its limitations, or just any other sort of final thoughts as we close out the failure that was the adaptation of the Electric State from its graphic novel form?
I think that there is no saving the electric state, and there never was, because they weren't interested in telling a story. They were interested in getting Millie Bobby Brown to be Millie Bobby Brown and Chris Pratt to be Chris Pratt, and then some robots, and something happens and the music swells the end. So if you're genuinely writing something, then I feel like you're going to be putting more effort and more drafting into making sure that your story has the effect that you want it to. And if you are only doing one draft because you assume that it's going to have that effect, then perhaps don't do that. If you will be reading and rereading it yourself to make sure that it has the vibes that you want, but then you're going to be looking to figure out what kind of impact that you have. Is this aesthetic that you're appropriating for what you're doing actually vibing with your overall theme? Is it connecting with what you want it to do? Is it so there are so many parts to writing that it's hard to determine one in particular. But if you wanted to create a novel that was kind of based as a video game, you look at the parts from the video game that can evoke some kind of feeling about it and make sure that those stay there. When I teach, it's funny that I didn't get any of this into this podcast because I actually have a class on adaptation. But when you're trying to adapt something, you look for what the core elements are. Like, what are the load-bearing images or themes that really make this feel the way I want it to? And you hang on to that, and then you work around it with your strong structure, strong characters, and develop it until it's doing what you want it to do, where it's creating the feeling as well as the story you want to tell. Does that make sense?
Oh, of course. I think that's what I try and do because I teach a different, she teaches adaptation of fairy tales or things that are out from under public domain. I have taught a class in the past about repurposing original elements of your fanfic ethically, and especially if you've written a fanfic that might be alternate universe or a bit far afield or have a lot of original characters you've introduced, and you're like, I actually really like this original character. I want to see if I had a similar world and world building, if I'm doing something set in a vampire-based fandom. I want to do vampires, make them my own, and then when I want to keep this original character. So when I start with my students in that class, I always sit with them and want them at first to say, who is my central character? How am I adapting them? I'm trying to encourage them usually to take whoever their OC is, their original character is from that story and expand out. But if, and this is harder, and this is where the load bearing walls come in, you're taking someone who is going to become your own character based on a show or a book or a movie character that does exist. okay, what is the core heart of this person? Is there struggle that they have daddy issues, or their struggle that they murdered someone and they got to get their ledger out of the red, or whatever? Real basic strokes. Okay, how can I repurpose this into someone different that has that same core struggle that drew me to this archetype to begin with and make it mine? So it's that question of what is the load bearing element. And for me, it's always, okay, you're going to recreate, you're going to put a spin on this world, you're going to put a spin on this adaptation, but what is the character you're trying to bring through this world that you're redesigning? And what is the heart of who they are and what they want? Because that's, again, ultimately going to be the vehicle and the focus to get you through this new novel, this new world you're building. I think, oddly enough, that comes back to Lord help us, Super Mario Brothers 1993. It's a weird little animal and a weird little adaptation, but because Luigi, especially, is the heart of this crazy movie, you buy it to an extent because you really want to root for him and what he's doing. So I'm not saying you don't need to also have sharp world building and sharp world building that you make your own or you adapt as your own. But I am saying that you need to have a character at the core that you know who they are, you know what they want, you know why they are, and you know what makes people want to follow them, which the Electric State definitely did not have. Until next time, Midnight and I will be back in a couple or few weeks with something new. But thank you for following and thank you for listening. Thank you for joining the Otherlands Editing Podcast. Look for our next episode coming soon. And in the interim, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, if you want more information or want to connect, you can find Margaret Bates and Midnight Voss at our site, Otherlands Editing. Until next time, keep writing and keep refining your words.